Welcome to our second podcast, inspired by the think tank on physician well-being that Jessie attended. We'll be talking about problem solving with approaches outside of the box. A reminder that our podcast is not medical advice. Our intention is to open our minds by thinking about well-being lessons we can learn from outside of the healthcare construct.
We hope you will discover that outside perspectives are needed to solve complex problems, both literally and figuratively, and that medicine has much to learn from artificial intelligence, the military, design concepts, virtual reality, photojournalism, art, yoga, nature, and more. The takeaways of this episode are an inspiration to use all of your potential resources when looking for solutions to challenging problems. So I thought we'd reflect a bit more on my weekend at Teravana and the Mindful MD think tank. And again, gratitude for an individual who is willing to step up and bring together thought leaders to think creatively about this. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting is that this collection of thought leaders was actually organized and sponsored by someone who's not in medicine. And so we so often have an insular approach to solving our challenges in medicine. And what was different about this weekend was the very differing perspectives that came together in this conversation, and really being inspired by different ways of seeing a problem, which for me, I've been looking at for a long time from within medicine. And so when you bring people from other disciplines and industries together, they can actually see it from a very different perspective and come up with some of the same solutions and some different solutions. So the first one I just wanted to reflect on is that compassion is a secret superpower. And we've talked a lot about compassion on this podcast, and we had Kristen Neff come and talk about compassion, and Steve Hickman come talk about compassion, and it pops up literally in almost every episode. And that humans need more compassion for one another and more compassion for ourselves in particular. So there was a lot of conversation about kindness. And one of the questions that they asked after each of the panels at this think tank was, in 60 seconds, what's the one thing that you think would make the biggest difference to improving the well-being of humans? And several people said compassion or kindness. And specifically, if we were all more kind to ourselves, that then the world would just be filled with people who are more replete and more kind. And when we're kind to ourselves, we're much more able to be kind to others. And so compassion is something that is useful across disciplines, and perhaps seeing how it's brought in other spaces where I think it's easier to bring into the work sometimes. It's harder to have self-compassion when another human being has had a bad outcome, for example. And so it's easier in potentially other industries, and watching how they do it and seeing how they approach it, I think can be a very helpful tool. Do you have thoughts on compassion, since I know you are on the board of Mindful Self-Compassion and doing all kinds of things in that space?
So we are all inherently able to tap into compassion. It is an inherent human trait. And the vast majority of the world's population, from research, has shown that it's easier for us as humans to be more compassionate for others than it is for ourselves. And I think especially in healthcare, where our training has not necessarily been intentional about teaching us self-compassion.
I'm thinking actually about the concept of compassion fatigue. And I think compassion can be a superpower, and it can be one of the main causes of physician non-well-being, is expressing compassion for others while not showing compassion for yourself. And so I sometimes like to shift into kindness, because kindness feels a little less draining and more equalizing between us as humans. We want to show up kind. And I think that for me, the compassion feels like it's easier to flow in the compassion for others, but not for myself. And kindness is easier to dose equally to all parties. And so that for some people who struggle with self-compassion, and I work with a lot of people where self-compassion is really hard to get to, perhaps you can start with kindness and self-kindness, and then you can make the up level to compassion. And I was actually just invited in my own coaching to make the up level to love. And it's not that I haven't been invited to do that, but I think you have to do layers of work to get there. And so if you struggle with compassion, can you start with kindness?
And kindness is part of compassion.
Yeah.
So it is definitely a step towards embodying compassion, whether it be for self or others.
Yeah. So the next concept that came from other industries too is this idea that trauma is trauma. And my take on this actually is that all humans have trauma. So we often talk about trauma informed and specific groups that have specific trauma. But when we spend a lot of time actually sharing stories and interviewing one another in some of these design thinking workshops, and what I learned is everyone has trauma and we're all a little bit attached. And I say that with compassion to our own trauma and our own experience and our own difficulties. But trauma might be the great equalizer. And there's much trauma in many other professions. And so when I heard from, a general in the military about the trauma people that he has worked with, and a journalist who goes to war-torn countries and the different kinds of trauma that they witness, and realizing that sometimes we sort of get lost in our own trauma experiences and second victims experiences and how that feels, and realizing that trauma is also part of the universal human condition. And so we can look to other industries and see how they handle trauma and bring that into our own experience. And so one of the people who attended this conference has actually developed this virtual reality thing, which I don't totally understand virtual reality, but what it's designed to do is actually help you recover from trauma, and having people do it early on. It's specifically designed to uplevel the parasympathetic nervous system, like we talked about in the last episode, and release dopamine. And so that then you feel better and you're able to respond to that initial onslaught of trauma in a way that doesn't have it sink as deeply into your nervous system. And so it's almost like preventive care. And so it's designed specifically for first responders. And as she described it, perhaps a police officer who was involved in a shooting, for example, would use this and get into this Zen state, which reminds me of mindfulness, except really up leveled, because it's like releasing high amounts of dopamine. And I should say that you're listening to Bach and catching butterflies and a beautiful thing. So it's not like a video game in that sense. It reminded me a little bit of a Disney experience, except better because it's for adults. So this idea that you would use it after the shooting before you gave your report so that you could be more thoughtful and give a more accurate report. And then after you gave your report, you would use it again, because obviously reliving and explaining and answering questions is traumatic in and of itself. And then you would do it again before you went home to your family to be protective against reacting to anything there or even suicide. And so it strikes me that this is something that we could certainly learn from in healthcare too. And why don't our healthcare providers have that experience if they have patients that die or trauma victims or have it in an ER, for example? We used to call them sentinel events. And if there was a sentinel event, could you go do this to sort of protect yourself and ease some of that so that the trauma doesn't seal in? I think much of the trauma in medicine comes from the fact that we don't acknowledge it as trauma. And so we're expected to witness a death and go right on and see the next patient.
Yeah, it becomes internalized. I can envision this technology to be so helpful, like even after just code blues.
Yes. Yeah. And it takes 3 minutes. That's the other thing. I think we say we don't have time, but we all have 3 minutes. And then the other thought that it brings to mind is just learning from that. And this was created by someone who does like photojournalism and was exposed to a lot of trauma and had some struggles in her own family and like came up, put all of these things together. But if we don't have access to that, could we just practice mindfulness? I often, before I went to this workshop, talked with people about practicing mindfulness on call, for example, or before you're going into a difficult meeting, or before you're going into a difficult surgery, that it helps you focus and it helps you get into just a much more zone flow space. And so I'm thinking that also after trauma, what even feels like trauma, because I don't think anyone gets to define what's trauma for you or traumatic for me, because a lot of things are triggered by childhood experiences and other experiences. And we talked in our episode recently about processing intense emotions, that sometimes it's layers and layers and layers upon trauma before you notice it, and it's too much. And so mindfulness is a form of virtual reality. It's just not quite as intense, but might that be another way until we all have access to something like this? But again, why not? If we know this works in some settings, why not bring this in? Why not bring this to ICU docs, for example, or ER docs in particular, or trauma surgeons? Like, there are a lot of cases for, as a pediatrician, OB was particularly traumatic for me, because we only get called when a baby's in distress and when there's just traumatic deliveries. We don't come to the happy ones. And so I would have loved it every time I got called to have that opportunity to sort of move back into whatever else I was doing.
It's not practical yet to have VR sets in every hospital, in every single department and division. Mindfulness, as you said, is easily accessible. And it reminds me of that Sharon Salzberg quote: mindfulness isn't difficult. We just need to remember to do it. So what if we intentionally sandwiched our difficult conversations or difficult events that occur in healthcare before and after, if possible, with some mindful moments?
Yeah, it's beautiful. And I think a lot of other professions, particularly I'm thinking like the military, they do a really good job of debriefing. And we do in some cases. So my recollection is that certain events get debriefing, but other events don't get debriefing. And so one thought that actually came up in this think tank was someone's actually doing something which is just like a weekly debriefing. And it's sort of like a cumulative stress rounds. And the idea is that we get exposed to traumas, little micro traumas all the time. And the process of gathering and creating space to do that and addressing it could be really helpful. Same thing for mindfulness. And same thing, I mean, if I could wear this virtual reality and get a little lovely dopamine hit like that every day, it was really lovely. So it occurs to me that there are ways to think about this outside the box, that we don't have to wait for people to be distressed, and we don't have to qualify, well, you have more trauma and you have less trauma and you deserve help and you don't. Like, let's take what works and spread it and use it where we can with the resources that we have. So the next concept that came up through having very different disciplines and different outside perspectives is that we as physicians aren't necessarily different or special. And I think it's a little bit like the cape wearing. And in the culture of medicine, the training of medicine, we celebrate how different we are and the specialness and uniqueness and the honor and the privilege of the work. And yet then it also makes it harder to address our well-being. And if we are humans, the same as everybody else, and we have human struggles, that then when we're also fallible and have struggles, it's less of an issue. And so this idea that we are similar to people in other professions doing hard work, and that we have human reactions to human experiences, and that we are like, I guess EMS is in the medical field, but EMS or police or any kind of first responder, and lots and lots of people work in challenging professions. And I think in my mind, we use that a little bit against ourselves to make it a harder problem to solve. And so my thought would be to frame it in a way that lots of other professions have lots of other trauma in their work. And if we are not special and we're all just humans, what works for humans who do hard jobs, who have burnout, and what can we learn from some of these other roles and industries? And so someone mentioned at the workshop that we are all animals. And I loved that idea. If you think about yourself as animals, right? We need walking, we need light, we need food, We get reactive when things are scary. We like to hide. We need sleep. We react to light in trees and all of these things. And so it might seem funny to approach it that way. And yet, if we're not meeting our basic human animal need, and this came from psychology, from a psychologist, that then of course we're having these reactions. And if you look at our healthcare system, we really aren't meeting our human animal needs. And if we even just better met our basic animal needs, what a different experience practicing medicine would be.
Treating us as we should be treated, which is basically a human being, and not setting these superhuman expectations upon ourselves or for each other.
Yeah, it's such a softer way. When you change the expectations, the problem also seems less challenging. Now, changing the expectations to me is a solution on both sides. We have to change our expectations of ourselves. We have to change our expectations of each other and our colleagues. And then the system has to change its expectations of us, and so do patients. And the expectations all around have to be human expectations and not performing at the highest level all day, every day for a life, because that's not human. So humans need rest. They need diastole 2/3 of the time. And yet I don't know a physician who has diastole 2/3 of the time.
Seems like this need for recalibration on multiple levels.
Yeah. So one of the things that we learned from AI and artificial intelligence and sort of big startup companies is also leading and trusting other people. And my experience in medicine is that we didn't necessarily trust. We were always like trusting and confirming. And, or I think because there have been, to be 100% honest, a ton of betrayals in medicine. And so nobody's trusting each other because the physicians during COVID feel betrayed. We were not taken care of. We were not given basic human rights. We were not given PPE when needed. And, no one was prepared for the pandemic. But just to understand that what works well is when we trust each other. And that if we could get back to this semblance of trusting, and that the solutions are going to be much more readily apparent when we trust each other. And I hadn't really thought about this idea of betrayal, but I think it's worth really thinking about for yourself. And I can think of many points along the way in my medical career where I felt betrayed by lots of things, usually the system, but even down to individuals. And, I think the betrayal comes in part because we give so much of ourselves and we give too much. And so it's very easy to have that expectation that if we're willing to overgive, other people should do the same. And then we feel betrayed. And so there's lots of complexities here. But this idea of being able to trust and letting others lead and not having to be in control all the time is actually very protective against burnout and distress.
I think that also allows space for one to recognize when we are over identifying with our professions as our only or most important identity, when really our professions are one facet of who we really are. So, yes, I am a physician, but only part of the time.
I might say you're a physician all the time and you're a human all the time, or you're a human who is a healer and a mother and a wife and an artist and a paddleboarder. Like you have all of these pieces there. So one of the other things that came up that's used a lot in other industries, but not so much in medicine, is a strength-based approach and really focusing on what each of us is good at in solving problems and looking at what's working for solutions. And at least in my experience in medicine over the years, our focus is always very much on what's not working, what's broken. And if I think back to like our department meetings and our annual, check-ins with the leadership, it was not usually about celebrating what's working and acknowledging what's working and learning from what's working. We might celebrate it and then we move on to what's broken and what needs fixing. And so really tapping into what's working on an individual level, on a department level, on a systemic level, because there are learnings there. There are many things in healthcare that are working that we're ignoring. And there are many things that each of us are really, really good at. And a lot of the way that our system is set up right now is that that's kind of taken away, and we're all expected to do the same thing and see the same number of patients and manage our inbox the same way. And a lot of the metrics and all of these things don't allow us to operate from our strengths. And so it was just eye-opening to think, like, what if we approach this problem by looking at, I used to be a site chief, so looking at everybody in the department's strengths and what they were good at, and like creating a practice for them that would work to those strengths. Given how complex healthcare is and all the needs that we have, our focus on efficiency has gotten us away from the strengths. And then we come to the problem reactive, struggling, completely depleted, and always focusing on what needs to be fixed.
So this helps to upregulate our capacity for positive attention bias.
Yeah. So to me, it's hopeful. And that's where the hope comes. And I found just this different way of thinking of things. The other thing about strengths-based training that came up is that many, many physicians I know now have other training. And so when we're in our physician realm, we focus on our role as physicians. But say you're a physician who also happen to be a lawyer, and I actually know quite a few, like they're experts in negotiation. We should be getting them to negotiate on behalf of physicians to help us figure this out and use their skills as negotiation. Or people who've done MPHs, let's bring in their population health. Let's bring in what we're good at and what other trainings we have to help solve this problem. And I often see a lot of tension about who's going to solve it and whose job it is to solve it. And instead of just saying, like, where's our wealth of experience, and particularly within our physicians who understand multiple worlds. And so I even within our smaller roles, like I had two worlds. I was a chief of wellness and a site chief. And so one has very different pressures than the other, but having a toe in two worlds makes it much easier to solve problems. And so I don't have a law degree and I don't have a business degree, but those people who have those, I think probably have very unique perspectives. And blending those two is actually a really powerful and I think underutilized tool to solve this problem.
I want to switch gears now and ask you a little bit more about a specific outside of healthcare approach using design. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, this design thinking is fun, first of all. And so it did not remind me of any physician department meetings I had had per se, although I have heard that many hospital systems are looking at design thinking. And it's a completely different approach to solving problems than we learned, say, on rounds, for example. So it's creative. And we actually started each design thinking session with a creative act and trying to get our brains to think differently. And so this is the perfect opportunity for you to share like some mindfulness ways of getting your brain to think differently. And one of these we used during the workshop.
So the 9 dots exercise is a very common exercise that you can do even if you wanted to, like right now. You simply draw 9 dots, so 3 rows of 3 dots in each row, so that there are 9 dots that are pretty much basically equidistant from each other. And the prompt is you have to draw 4 straight lines that connect all the 9 dots without picking your pen or pencil off the page. And when you approach the solution, the whole process of how you approach it is very telling and eye-opening. You simply have to pay attention to how you're approaching it because it might mirror how you approach your usual problems in your own day-to-day life. There might be temptations to just look up the answer, like using our smartphones or computers. There could be a little jadedness because you have encountered this mind riddle before. But basically, the solution involves you literally having to go outside of the self-made construct of this box that you made in your mind when you connect the outside perimeter forming a square. So you literally have to go outside of that in order to solve the riddle.
And what's interesting about design thinking is it's really to get you to think about things differently. And so the encouragement is to brainstorm. And one of the things they said in the rules, which I thought was eye-opening for me, is brainstorm without judgment. So I will brainstorm, and as I'm making the list, I'm like, yeah, that's not a good idea. And you're constantly just like, or I'm not going to bring that up because I know why it's not the right answer. And so in design thinking, it's quantity is better than quality. And the thought is you put the idea out there, not because it's necessarily a good idea, but that it might stimulate a thought in someone else's mind. And so that was really a powerful shift. The other thing is that it was creative doing. And so not being, but doing. And there was a lot of drawing and a lot of markers and a lot of colors and a lot of placing things and moving your body and stickies and changing places to hear what other people have to say and moving around and being kind of literally in the doing of the process. And that by engaging in the creative process, whether it was drawing or interviewing or everybody always had a role, that got your brain to think in a different way. And it makes me think of also, even in yoga, we try to get your brain to think in a different way by doing inversions. That's like changing your perspective. And so all of these are tools to think in a different way. We did not do yoga in the design thinking workshop, but it's a similar trick from a different industry. And then embracing ambiguity. And so they make you stay in ambiguity a lot in design thinking and sitting in it. We like to solve the problem and move on in medicine, make a decision and move on. And so this is the opposite way of thinking about things. And it may be why we're struggling to solve the physician wellness well-being problem, if you think about it, because we're not comfortable in ambiguity. We like to do what's evidence-based. And this actually came up a lot in this workshop, is that maybe this is not the place for evidence-based, and maybe it requires different solutions. And that if we actually, like, if we know something works, we should try it and maybe collect the data that way. But that many institutions say, well, we won't try it until there's data. What's the evidence? We won't, do this or do that. And this is different than medicine. And physician well-being is different than medicine. And so allowing ourselves to embrace ambiguity and try things that we don't necessarily know work, it's just a different end game. And so there's no right answer in design thinking also. And so the idea is there's no right place to get to. There isn't a right versus a wrong. There isn't a better or a worse. And it's really about exploring. It has a couple of linkages to coaching around asking good questions. And one of the questions that they ask a lot is, how might we? And I really liked that question. How might we make this happen? Or how might I make this happen? And in the groups, you're working in teams. But yes, so how might I? It's such a soft question, and your brain opens up. Do you like how might I? Doesn't that feel very different?
Yeah, it's spacious. It opens up
Yeah.
possibilities. And even just this creative design thinking process and the ambiguity creates the spaciousness that sometimes I feel medicine becomes overly reductionistic
Yes.
in some of our approaches and solutions. And so, yeah, I'm all for this, especially with the well-being issue.
And the other topic that we didn't bring up, but feels like it belongs here, is something else that creates spaciousness, which is actually our spaces. And we had an interior designer who came and talked about healing spaces and the importance of color and the importance of texture and the importance of light and the importance of windows and all of these things that have really been neglected in the physician well-being space. And that we know that's why, new startup companies have really nice environments, and they don't have, many physician lounges have gone by the wayside. They have like workrooms where people work side by side and they see other people, and, or, there's light-filled spaces with plants. And We talked about like what colors are healing for you. And so the woman who ran the design workshop, and we talked a bit about the power of beauty in the last podcast, but she talked about asking yourself the question of what is healing to you, what environment feels healing, and to close your eyes and ask that, what colors feel healing, what kind of art feels healing, what kind of music feels healing, and do what you can to create a healing environment for you. And also to create a healing environment for your colleagues and to create a healing environment for your patients. And there is work being done on mindful hospitals and hospitals with gardens and all of these things, but we could do so much more. And one of the things that I have noticed certainly is that a lot of hospitals have healing spaces for patients now, but they forgot to think about the people who work in the hospital in terms of healing spaces for them. And a really true well hospital would have healing spaces for everyone. And if our physicians felt better, the patients would be better healed.
I'm so glad you brought that up because there's literature on optimal healing environments, and in designing the new clinic space that I currently practice pulmonary integrative medicine, I should say, out of. I took a lot of those elements, basically bringing in aspects of nature into the clinic environment, making sure that all the different elements found in nature are found also in our clinic, from wood ceiling installations, wood doors, countertops, and the walls that reflect Earth's colors. All of that can be very intentionally designed. And I will say it makes a huge difference in how we feel as people who work there and provide healing care for others, as well as for people who come in to be healed.
I think there is just tremendous opportunity there and tremendous knowledge to come from other spaces and knowledge of success and what leads to healing and productivity. We have so much information, and it may be a longer term problem to solve, but there are a lot of short term things that you could also do in terms of bringing photographs and creating clean spaces and throwing up a little paint and a few things, so that it's a short and a long term problem, but with tremendous potential.
So, as always, we'd like to close our podcast with some reflection questions. So, thinking about your own life with your friends and loved ones who work outside of healthcare, where are some aspects that you could get curious about with them that might be helpful for you in your own life and your profession? And then where can you be more creative in your life? Where can you invite an intentional inclusion of creativity?
And how can you change your spaces to be more well? How can you create more healing spaces and spaces in your life that create well being for you? And in the spirit of the Teravana Mindful MD think tank, I want to propose the question that they mentioned at the end of each panel discussion. And it was, what is your 60-second solution to well-being for the world? What's the one thing that you would change? Hopefully, these past two podcasts have given you some ideas to think about and inspirations. And what is the one thing from there that you would like to take action on? The other thing that we learned from other industries, of course, is that many other industries act a lot faster than medicine in terms of creating change. And there was an ER ICU doc who was present, and he asked, his one ask of the think tank was that we take swift ER ICU like action on physician well-being and the crisis of human well-being, and that we show up in the manner that we would in an ER in a code, given that it is pretty much a crisis, and that we approach it that way. And so I don't mean to stifle the creativity with the urgency, but to me, there's a hope there, and there's a love and a caring to that request. And so I hope to honor it by sharing these podcasts. And I'm hoping that since most of our listeners do work in healthcare, that something here will inspire you. And can you make one change that you bring back one step forward. And if each of us make one small change, one step forward, it will add up to a significant change and some momentum moving forward.
We can be the change that we want to see.
Each of us, one step at a time.
Join us to literally step outside of the healthcare environment to be in community and learn from each other at the Mindful Healers Connect in Nature retreat at historic Muir Woods and Green Gulch Zen Center. We only have 3 spaces left at the time of this recording. We hope you can join us.
And if that weekend doesn't work, I nudge you to take care of yourself so that you can be part of the solution to this problem. And that might be joining another retreat if that works for you. It might be getting some coaching. It might be practicing mindfulness and creating a mindfulness practice. It might be joining us in the Mindful Healthcare Collective. It might be joining me for yoga. Take one small action to take care of yourself so that you can begin to be part of the solution to the problem. We need everyone's voices and everyone's minds and everyone's hearts in the mix to move us forward towards a better healthcare system and healthcare experience so that we can all experience more health and joy in our lives.
Join us after the sound of the singing bowl for our mindful moment offering.
Thanks so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the podcast, please share, leave us stars and reviews, and come back and listen again. Have a beautiful day.
Welcome to today's Mindful Moment, a conversation and relaxation around curiosity, inspired by the learnings from other industries and other ways of thinking about things. Noticing that curiosity is an amazing tool for solving complex problems when we're frustrated. So we'll take a moment to explore curiosity and any resistance we might have to it. And so with that introduction, find a comfortable seat and just take a moment to arrive. Notice your feet on the earth or wherever they may be, and notice your sit bones wherever they may be. Connect your sit bones into whatever you're sitting upon, tilt your pelvis, and stack your spine with kindness, one vertebrae upon the other, all the way up towards the sky. And just take a moment. Take a moment to notice how you feel. Take in a huge inhale through your nose and an exhale through your mouth. And ponder this idea of curiosity. Are you comfortable? What are you thinking right now? Curiosity is questions. It's instead of judging and stating facts, it's exploring. Can you take in a deep exploratory breath, sending the oxygen everywhere throughout you? And a huge exhale, letting go of the judgments and the stuck and the preconceived notions. Take an inhale of kindness and compassion for all the challenges and allowing them to go on the exhale, letting go of the struggle and the suffering. It's not necessary. There are no prizes for the most suffering. Take in another inhale through your nose. And an exhale through your mouth, let it go. Take a moment to pause. Notice already how you may feel different. Close your eyes if it feels comfortable. And take a moment once again to notice. Notice your hands. Notice if they feel heavy or light, strong or weak, hard or soft, tingly or numb. Can you notice the sensations in your hands without judging them? Is your mind drifting? Have curiosity about that. Why is your mind drifting? What is it trying to accomplish? Curiosity about judgment. Curiosity about what is. Sometimes when we're curious, we're looking for what's wrong. Notice if that's your tendency. What if getting curious was just being interested, exploring, being awestruck, being excited? What if we didn't have to find a solution? We were merely exploring. So take a moment here to get curious. Be curious about anything. Be curious about why you chose to practice today with me. Be curious about what's happened so far in your day without judgment. What if curiosity were friendly? What if it was a tool, a willingness to see and explore and learn? If you were curious about complex, challenging problems, places where you felt stuck, what might happen? Take in an inhale through your nose and an exhale through your mouth. And just pausing once again to think about this curiosity idea. When you hear the word curiosity, do you feel more childlike? Do you notice any shifts in your chest? Perhaps less tension, perhaps more light? Just notice, be curious. Bring a hand to heart, the other hand to top, and be curious. Notice how your heart feels. Be curious about whatever is under there, tightness, looseness, however it feels. Be curious. Allow it without judgment. Curiosity is letting go of judgment. Can you let it go? Take in another inhale and an exhale, releasing all the tension. Be curious about how you feel now. Slowly open your eyes with curiosity, hands still on your chest. Notice how that feels. And when you're ready, lower your hands to your thighs and pause. And be curious now about how you feel compared to when you started. Curiosity is just questioning, wondering, exploring. What if you went back out into the world, wondering and exploring? Have a beautiful day. May it be full of wonder and exploration and curiosity. And may all the judgments float away, no longer necessary. Have a beautiful day. We'll see you next week. Namaste.